Hey, good morning, good evening.
Good evening for me.
How are you?
Yeah, not bad at all. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you for joining me for a chat about our favorite topic, Business Central and functional consulting.
Mm, it's a very exciting. It's an exciting thing to do. Very exciting thing to do.
It is. So,
I'm trying to remain excited because I've literally just come off a call. I've come off a call where I went on. I tend to go onto these calls early so that I'm the first one there, just because I really hate being late. And so I went onto the call, and the first thing I heard after I'd been typing, I've been doing some emails, and I just had the screen up there, and I was typing away, and all I heard was. And it was the project manager I've been working with who's obviously had a hell of a day and then went into this meeting where absolutely everybody else had had a hell of a day and I was the only one at the bottom of the screen. I could see my little thumbnail and me going still,
well,
still happy
someone's
after the end of the day and thinking am I doing this wrong or is everybody else doing it wrong? I don't
uh,
know.
that's fantastic. Someone has to bring cheer to the project meetings, right?
Well, I'm just wondering the point at which. So I've been working with this partner for since January, so eight months now, and I'm just working out what point they stop saying you're always cheerful to the point at which they start going he's really annoying. So I don't know. Maybe we may have got to that stage already. I don't know. It's hard to tell.
No, projects can be long and arduous, so I think it's always good to have some positive vibes in there, right?
I think it's absolutely essential. I think you've got to. I don't think there's no point in being grumpy about it because it's all, I keep saying to the two project managers I'm working with, all it is a list of tasks
Yep.
that you have to break down and do in order. And that's it. And they're going, yeah, but it's more complicated than that. And I'm going, the individual tasks can be complicated, in which case you break them down into smaller ones that are less complicated, and then you do them in order. And they're going, it's not as simple as that. I'm going, it is, It,
It's literally that
it
simple.
really is. And you're going, yeah, but so and so's in a really bad mood. And I'm going, yeah, but that's not to do with the tasks. That's to do with the person who's in a bad mood. You just have to go,
Yep.
you being in a bad mood's not terribly helpful to this. Can we just have you do the thing you've agreed to do and stop mumping?
And a story that I will never forget is I am often on projects or get calls where someone says they have an emergency, a crisis, and this is a serious problem. The world is ending. Well, one night, my wife has been a nurse for 25 years, and
Yeah.
she's worked in the emergency room for maybe 15 plus of those. And so one night she comes home and says, "Yeah, two of my patients died, like right in front of her, doing
Hmm.
CPR the whole bit." But
Yeah.
her job is sometimes, unfortunately, watching people die in an
Yeah.
ER, crash cart the whole bit.
Yeah.
And I said, "Ah, perspective, right?
Hmm.
Anything that occurs in my business application consulting
Yeah.
life is absolutely not an
Not an
emergency."
emergency. Yeah, it's
Not an
true.
emergency. I don't
Yeah.
care whose hair is on fire about it.
Yeah.
I just need to remember what my wife does for a living. And it's like, oh, okay, that's an emergency.
Yeah.
Anything
That's
I'm dealing with is just like it
not.
barely gets to the annoying level, right?
Yeah.
So, like, yes, I
Yeah.
understand money can be lost. It can be stressful, but it is not an emergency. So that was actually great. So now I just sit back. I'm like, oh, nothing's an emergency. So I have a pretty
Yeah.
good job.
No, I think absolutely true. My dad was a general practitioner, and we used to get I grew up in a pretty small town, and he was well known by everybody. So people would just turn up at the door, like in the middle of the night, going, "I'm not well, doctor," and he'd be like, "There's literally a hospital like
Oh
200
my
yards down the
gosh.
road. Could you just go to the ER?" And you know, he stood there in his pajamas with his hair stood up on end. And yeah,
Uh,
but nothing's an emergency really in comparison to that kind of stuff. So yeah, you're absolutely right. But
yeah,
yeah, so hopefully everybody had cheered up a little bit, but maybe
excellent.
not. Who can say?
So let me pull up if I can figure out this monstrosity of buttons here. let's see, I September 4th, so almost 2 weeks ago, you
Hmm.
had an interesting tweet where you shared that you were working on kind of a process overview, process stories to figure out, what's going on with this particular project. And you came up with an elegant solution, which I fully appreciate what that means. And you love doing it. It's hard, but very rewarding. And yet, we don't often see these stories or hear about them. And I thought that was an interesting point. So, we'll see some great videos, great blog posts, great discussions about very clever technical solutions, right? We go to the Birinar, we hear about these fantastic Visual Studio Code extensions and widgets that'll automatically do whiz bang magic stuff with your projects. But we often don't hear about the functional consultant who redesigned a process to save hours every week for the users, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So I guess what does that look like to you, and what have you done, or what do you want to share about that?
So, okay, well, the thing I was working on at the time, so I've got three clients at the minute, all of them quite chunky, and they all do very different things. And one's kind of in the financial services sector, and one's in food delivery, and one's in forestry. And they're all doing entirely different things. And what they do can all be fitted into Business Central. So I'm kind of accustomed to speaking to a new client and listening to what they're saying, and all the time they're saying it, I'm kind of thinking about all the tables as like buckets and going, well, that bit slots in there, and that bit slots in there, and that bit slots in there, and then every now and again you go, well, hang on a minute, if that's the case, then what yeah, if they all slot into those bits, how do they join up? And then you start working out how they join up and which bits of which bit of data will join up to what, and then what functions need to occur to make the thing happen that the customer wants to happen. And then you have to try and figure out what it is about what they're doing. What it is about what they're doing because it's the right business process to do it. It's the most efficient way of doing it. And what is it that they're doing because they've always done it that way, and therefore could do with being redesigned? And what is it they're doing because they've been constrained by perhaps not even their existing system, but some legacy system several iterations down the track, maybe 20, 30 years ago. And so there's been a way of doing it that's been dictated by that legacy system that they've just inherited and gone on inheriting. And so you've got the two things. One is how does what they do fit in Business Central, and how can you replicate that for them? And is what they're doing the right way of doing it? And I love that, and I absolutely agree with you that the stuff you see the developers producing I'm absolutely in awe of, and I can't quite get my head around how they managed to do it. And there's a guy I work with on a regular basis who I've known for a long time. And he used to do dev for me when I was a customer, and he was the developer in the partner that I was my vendor. And he's amazing. And he was just doing some fairly minor stuff for me on this particular project, actually. And I was testing it yesterday. And he will go off and he'll do what I've asked him to do, but he'll also think about how it's going to get used. And suddenly something will crop up in the middle of you testing, and you go, oh my God. That pop-up window saying, are you sure you want to do this? Or do you want to also do this? Is brilliant. And so you see that all the time. People tell stories about that all the time. It's great. But no one ever looks at the background and goes, who broadly laid out the process whereby we were going to come up with that piece of development? Who was it who said in the first instance, do you know what they need to do? They need to do this, this, and this. And actually, can we have a table hanging off the back of this that they then go and look up? And then that dictates this, and then we want a little flow field here, and if we drill down into that, we can see these processes, and that doesn't seem to happen. And I really love putting that together, and I find it quite hard to do it by myself. I quite often do it in conjunction with someone else. My current boss is absolutely brilliant at kind of taking something I've written up and then going, what about this? And then you go, ooh, yeah, I hadn't
Yep.
thought about that. Yeah.
Yep.
And her thing is, how do you reverse it? And so you
Mm.
come up with something, you go, this is great, I love this, this is really good, this is going to really work. Listen to this. And then you go, she sits there and listens, goes, So if they do it wrong, how do they reverse it? And you're like, oh,
Interesting.
yeah, that doesn't really work, does it? And then you've got to go and redesign it.
Interesting. And
Yeah.
I think one of the challenges of kind of capturing the value of those is those are often kind of smaller or spur of the moment, or just they're just kind of inserted in the process, and it's not this clear, distinct deliverable like an extension or a chunk of code
Yeah.
or something concrete. It was a just a discussion that happened to flow a particular way, and you have this discovery, and it's not anyone saying, "Oh my gosh, consider how valuable that is."
Yeah.
And it was just one little point that someone brought up, a question here, a what if there,
Mm.
and can we do this? And it can significantly alter the trajectory of how you implement a product or a software.
There was a it was a customer I worked for a while ago when I was freelance, and they had a whole issue about how they invoiced stuff. So they were buying goods and drop shipping them to their customers, and then obviously they were issuing sales invoices and purchase invoices, and they were back to back. And then when the purchase invoice comes in, they're matching it to the purchase order that they've shipped out and everything. But they had they had a kind of like a really weird crossover between the sales department and the purchase department, who didn't really ever speak to each other, except that what would happen is that the supplier would send the invoice in, and the purchase department would print the invoice out, and then they would take it downstairs to the sales department, and they'd give it to the person in the sales department. The person in the sales department would mark it off with biro, and then they would carry it back upstairs to the purchase department. The purchase department would check it against the purchase order, and then they would post the purchase order. So they'd been doing this using Pegasus, I think, for years. And they were saying, and I was going, do you need to print all that stuff off? It's all arriving on PDF. Do you need to do that? And I tried to persuade them that document capture would be a really good idea, and OCR, and they were just like not interested in spending the money, which is fine. And I said, well, why don't you use Teams? And they were going, what do you mean? And they had Office 365. And we're going, why don't you just use Teams and just, open save that document to the team, and then just both of you can go in and edit it simultaneously. And they were like, and so I showed them, and it was like, oh, it's magic. And literally one of them said, it's great, but I'm going to have to stop eating donuts at lunchtime because I don't have all the exercise of going up and down the stairs anymore.
That is hilarious.
So it wasn't even Business Central. It was just a thing that they had. It never occurred to them that they had these tools at their disposal they were paying for, just weren't using them.
And that reminds me, I when I go to the local car dealer to have my oil changed, or what routine service, every single thing that occurs at that dealership, I go to this checkout window where I have to pay, and there are these like 3 or 4 people behind the counter, filled with a wall of filing cabinets and paper everywhere. And I just watch this like, what is going on? It's this very orchestrated, like clearly it's this entire 87-step process they're doing. And I watch as for like, maybe I have a prepaid oil change where literally $0 is exchanging hands here.
Yeah. Yeah.
They have 4 copies of every single document. And I'm just watching in horror as this poor woman behind the counter has to collate 4 copies. And it's not just 1 or 2 pieces of paper. It's like 6+ pages of paper for one oil change, and there's 4 copies of everything. And so she's literally collating, stapling, stamping, signing, annotating. And I just ask her, why are there 4 copies of everything here? And she says, I don't know. And she just knows that one copy goes to me, one
Yeah.
copy goes in this wire bin, these two copies go over here, and magically she thinks one copy gets filed somewhere in a warehouse somewhere. And
Yeah.
I'm thinking, wow, you just filed 24 pieces of paper, all stapled, stamped, collated, signed, and whatever. And it's going to sit in a warehouse somewhere where you're paying thousands of dollars a month for a $0 transaction. And I was like, have they considered electronic documents? And of course, she doesn't know the status, and
No, of course
but
not.
she has no idea why she is doing any of the things she's doing. But she's dutifully producing 24 pieces of
Yeah.
paper for a $0 transaction.
And it's interesting because actually those people are fascinating when you're doing a discovery and implementation
Yep.
because you there's two ways they can go. They're either enormously relieved that you're going to take the burden of this tedious work off
Yep.
them, or they're enormously suspicious that you're trying to take the tedious burden of this horrible work off them, and therefore lose them their job.
Right.
I'm forever saying, but what are the things that you are? So when you get stressed, why do you get stressed? And they're going, oh well, the directors come in and they want me to produce all this information, and they've got to put it all together on a spreadsheet and get them this report. And I say, okay, so do you like doing that? And you go, well, it would be all right if I had time to do it. And I'm saying, well,
Right.
if you didn't have to carry this piece of paper up and down the stairs all the time, would you not have the time to spend the time doing that and actually get some pleasure out of it and possibly learn something from the information you're passing over to the MD? I suppose maybe I would. Yeah, maybe.
Yeah.
Okay, well, maybe we should try and then get rid of this thing that just involves you shinning up and down the stairs the whole time, and get you actually engaged in producing the report instead.
Yeah, and I one way I think of it is we're eliminating the low value and zero value tasks that you're performing that are occupying hours of your time, like
Yeah,
waiting for a report to run or
yeah,
mindlessly having to click boxes or check boxes and
yeah,
process transactions in a system where you're literally adding no value. You're simply a human process automator, right?
yeah.
And once you eliminate those, the opportunity to produce actual value in your
Mm,
job, lots of opportunities.
yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. We had a really good example. So the company I worked for when I first installed Nav, we'd been working with this sort of green screen DOS based stock control system, and then we were using Sage for invoicing, and so there was a lot of duplicate work, having to kind of key the invoices that we had produced in the stock control system into Sage so that we could actually do the financial transactions, and. And so we went through quite a painful process putting Nav in, but people could kind of see the purpose of it because they could see that it was going to take away this bore. It was really boring work, and we were fairly tightly staffed, and so they could kind of see that they were going to go through some pain to learn it, and then things would get easier. And so we did that, and that was an easy win. And then we started looking at the data that we were producing in Nav and how we might use that to start refining the other processes. And so we did two things. One of them was that we completely reorganized. It was a book wholesale company. One of them was that we completely reorganized the way the warehouse was laid out because we could see what was moving quickest,
Right.
and move that to the front so that we had shorter picking runs so the guys weren't having to walk so far and therefore get it done quicker. And then the other one that was slightly more radical was I did a piece of analytic work where we worked out how much it was costing us to keep salespeople on the road and how much time they were spending traveling rather than selling.
Right.
And we took them all off the road.
Wow.
And it was really startling. And we moved that company in the space of 4 years from being a £6 million turnover company to a £12 million turnover company.
Wow.
Because not only had we saved overhead by not employing, not using the cars and not having to employ more people because we had greater capacity. We had increased that capacity so that we could throughput more business.
Yep.
It was an amazing transformative thing, and I always take that with me whenever I go to a new customer and say, look, these are the things you can do. so that when I've then done the discovery and I'm writing up how it's going to work for them, I've got at the back of my mind always that you're looking to actually either save them money or make them more money. It's got to do one of those two things. Otherwise, why would you do it? What's the point?
That's a fantastic story. Wow. And it's
kind of
a
how I
very
fell in love with Nav.
interesting. Interesting. I often I don't know that I have as a big a win as that in terms of restructuring, because I'm often brought in on more of a smaller, narrower aspect of the business. And I had a project where a customer processed credit cards, and they would process them using the software, but the software had this strange limitation where if a transaction didn't go through properly, say the credit card was expired or it was declined for whatever reason, that software would not reprocess the transaction. It couldn't do it automatically. So they were sitting there constantly reprocessing failed transactions. So they said, Steve, can you help us automate the reprocessing of these failed transactions? I said, yes, I can do that. But if we're going to automatically reprocess failed transactions, why don't I just automatically reprocess all transactions, both new ones and ones that failed, so that it's just one process. You're not having to go over here to initially process and go over here to reprocess. And they said, wow, okay, that'll work for us. So this routine processes new transactions, records failures in detail so they know why. And then I said, well, if we know this credit card's expired, why bother? Why don't I just let you know so you can fix the problem? Or if this card declined for some reason, I'll let you know what the reason was so you can fix it. And then I'll automatically just reprocess. They said, wow, that's great. And then they said, okay, once you process all these transactions, can you record them as cash receipts so that we can then go and apply and say which invoices they paid off? And I thought, that sounds kind of strange. If I'm processing payments, I'm recording the payments, and I know what invoice this paid, why don't I just automatically pay off the invoice for you? Why are you doing this manually? And they thought, wait, you can do that? Like, yes, I'm already doing all this stuff in code automatically. Why don't I just do that last step for you?
Yeah.
And it just hadn't occurred to them. And so now this process looks at the invoices, charges the credit card, records a payment, applies it to the invoice, pays it off. Everything is automatic. And I think it's processing roughly $1 million a week now. And it just runs, and it sends them an email. And on the one hand, I'm like thrilled. I'm like, wow, this is amazing. On the other hand, I'm kind of horrified. Like, oh my gosh, my program's just running silently, and I haven't had to touch it in 3 years. Like,
what if it breaks?
Exactly. I'm actually quite nervous about that, but it's worked very well.
That's why I'm glad I don't code. I'm really glad I don't code because, so. This is going to sound really, really chicken, but in a way, for me, developers are a bit of a safety net, though, because you can go, I think we should do this X, Y, Z, and you've got some developers who'll go, okay, I'll do that for you, and they do it, and you go to UAT and you're like, that's an absolute car crash. It doesn't work at all, and fortunately, I don't go, I can't believe you did that, developer, because the developer will inevitably go, I just did what you told me to. I look at it and go, I've described that really badly. It's a terrible process. But, some people like the guy I was talking about earlier on will go, he'll talk it through and he's telling the story in his head. You can see him doing what I do, which is, once upon a time there was a beautiful princess and her evil father. And he's telling the story going, here's the customer, they're coming along, they're placing an order, they're doing this. And so he's stepping it through and going, how would it be if I'm the person at the receiving end of this, how's it working? Yep. And so he quite often catches me. And I think that's really important. So I can't imagine the horror of having your app silently running away in the background, and you're thinking, oh, is it really working? Is it though? Is it though?
And to that point about the story, right now I'm working on several applications, and At first, I thought the challenge was going to be the code, the technical, the learning the details and the plumbing and writing that code and getting it to work. Turned out that I now realize we can pull that off, right? Sure, there'll be some bugs, but we can easily fix those bugs. The challenge is knowing what we don't know or what we're missing about the process. We did a beta release and we thought, yeah, we're proud. We have a beta release. Great. Go test it. Then we had a moment where we looked at it and like, what? Why do we have 3 fields here? What does that even mean? How would a customer do this? What if they want to do this? And we realized, we didn't really think through that section of that window and what it meant and what is the process around that. So we just said, okay, great. Totally fine with that. We're going to scrap those and we're redesigning that entire portion of the window. And we're just having walkthroughs like, okay, this customer wants to do it this way. This customer wants to do it that way. How do we incorporate that just at a process level before we write any code? And so our developer mocked it up, put some placeholder fields in there and said, okay, if this worked and how would we do that? And we're just kind of bouncing around. And it's a different perspective of, it's not, we're coding it like set in stone. It's more like, okay, let's mock it up. Let's proof of concept. Let's talk about how this would work and just be ready to change it, be flexible. And it's less code as this monolithic deliverable. And it's more as, okay, this is a scratch pad. We're just going to sketch it out and work through and see what comes up. And it was an interesting lesson where now a majority of my time is just trying to figure out how all these pieces are going to work. And it's much less like writing any chunk of code that is hard and fast and the final solution. So.
I've got a friend who's probably the guy. He was the guy he was sort of a consultant / developer who did the first system that I ever used, and he got me into this, and he was telling a story about he worked for a coal business, and he was putting them onto nav, and he had this whole thing about how there was a weighbridge. And the trucks would drive onto the weighbridge, and they knew how much the trucks weighed, and they had graded the coal beforehand, so they knew the quality of the coal on the truck. And so obviously the weight of the whole truck on the weighbridge, less the known weight of the truck, is the weight of the coal. And then that's it, bang, logged into the system, booked in, and that's fine. And so he was demoing this, and they had go live in a couple of weeks. And he had the weighbridge operator, and he was training him up. And the weighbridge operator was going, "This is really good. I'm really liking this. It's great. So does it do the same thing for the trains?" And he went, "The what?" And he went, "Yeah, the trains." And Mark said, "What trains?" And he pointed out the window over the weighbridge for the trucks, and there's this much bigger weighbridge. And with trains coming onto it, and he was going, like, no one had mentioned trains. And he said, "You didn't tell me about the trains." And the bloke's going, "Look, the weighbridge is huge. Did you not see it?" And he was going, "No, I was asking you what you needed, and you didn't tell me." So he said, obviously it wasn't that problematic to just read code a little bit to accommodate the trains as well. So I tell that story whenever I go in to do discovery meetings with customers, because I want them to think about what their trains are, because there's all this stuff that they know that they do, but they don't have to think about it. And I'm saying, I don't know, because I've never cut down a tree or delivered a pint of milk or, worked in a bar. I don't know how that works. You have to tell me exactly how it works. And the other thing I did, I used to work for a chain of bookstores in my early career. And there was one point where, this was kind of late 80s, and there was a group of senior managers were taken away to a hotel with some guys from IBM, and they wanted us to spec out a new till system, a new kind of point of sale system. And so we got there was people working on the stock room, and there were people working on stock control, and there were people working on buying and purchasing and procurement and that kind of stuff. And the group I was in was actually on point of sale. And so they got us to kind of to storyboard what happened. to describe exactly how the thing should operate. So, you get the book and you scan the barcode, and then, the price comes up, it looks up the price and all this kind of stuff. And so we gave it to the engineers, and they came back to us the following day for their kind of follow-up session. And they said, do you want the till drawer to open? Do you want the cash register drawer to open? And we were like, yeah, obviously. And they were going, yeah, you didn't say that. You've not said that anywhere. And it's the same. It's a train. It's the train with the coal on it that no one mentioned. And we're going, we're all a bunch of retailers. Of course you want the till drawer to open. What idiot doesn't want a till drawer to open? That's exactly what you want to have happen.
It's obvious.
It's obvious. So you don't tell anybody because it's so obvious. And that's what I'm always after. I'm after the train or the opening of the till drawer.
So that reminds me, the train story, that is fantastic. When
I
I
love
was
that.
like 23 or 24, like I was a fresh young kid out of college. I worked for a large consulting firm in the United States, a subsidiary of the big six accounting firms at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And I was one of the few people in that firm, because they're primarily an accounting firm. They had a consulting arm. I was the few people in the entire organization that actually could code and had some technical experience. And so they threw me on this project for I was in kind of the small business consulting division. They set me on a plane, sent me to this customer in another state, and had me like try and help this team of the high-end consultants charging $100 an hour. So I had no idea what was going on. I'm sitting in a room, and apparently the project was, we have millions of customer records in this system. We have millions of customer records in this system. Those systems don't talk. We need you to help us design a way to match and correlate those records, right?
Mm-hmm.
So a deduping exercise, as we called it. And so I walk into this room fresh out of the airport, no idea what's going on. I'm sitting in this room where they had prepared this big presentation to the executives of this project. And they said, well, we're going to start with zip code. And if we get a zip code match, that's a first indicator that we have a likely candidate for a match. And then we're going to narrow down on address and do this algorithm. Then we can include phone number, and then we can include company name and address, right? And that's how we're going to think about matching these records. And the executive sat there with just a blank face and said, we are a multi-billion-dollar, multinational, global organization with customers in every country of the world. You realize that Nigeria doesn't have US zip codes. And there was absolute silence in the room. These high-end consultants charging hundreds of dollars an hour had failed to consider that this Fortune 500 company has customers outside the US. And I'm in the corner of this room like, oh my gosh, get me out of here. Like, who has stuck me on this project? It was terrifying. And like, you could just see the confidence level go to zero. Like, who have I hired here? And I was like, wow. That was an eye-opening experience. And
that's a great story. That's a really, really good story. I love that. That's because so was there a solution? What was the solution? Can you remember? Or
I have since learned a lot about addresses and deduplication in the process. And unfortunately, I've spent many months on this over several different projects, and there is no great solution. It is a very, very difficult problem. And this was back in, this is like in 1998, 96, 98 timeframe. And there were no, great SaaS online web services. Like, that technology didn't really exist. You couldn't tap into global postal service databases and do address validation. It's a very, very difficult problem at the time. You would have to buy databases, import them, attempt to understand the structure of an Indian database, a Japanese database, and really, really hard problem at the time. And I don't recall what happened, but I was only peripherally involved. I have a feeling that project did not go well. Um, and so I got pulled into an ancillary version of that project that involved trying to support 20 some languages for the different customers around the world. So that kind of gave me a different angle on the
Yeah,
challenge they
yeah.
were having. But that was just a shocking moment, and it was horrifying to be in the room, even associated with the people who were working
Oh,
on that
that's
project.
I can't imagine. I can film myself wanting to kind of hide just hearing you tell the story.
Yep.
It's really interesting because I've just been reading Ralph Kimball's book, The Data Warehouse Toolkit, and he talks a lot. There's a whole chunk on addresses and all this kind of stuff. So as soon as you started talking, I thought, oh, this is going to be the zip code thing.
Yep.
And
Yep.
sure enough, it is. Yeah, yeah.
So,
So that,
a question in the chat from Christian Lens, and it's an interesting topic for which I have some ambivalence. So, how
mhm.
many of your clients have documented their processes at the start of the project? And I'll go and say how many have documented any part of their process at the end of the project, and what do you think about such process documentation? And I have my own thoughts, but I'll hold those.
I kind of think so. So none is the
Yep.
answer to the initial question, and hello, Christian, and yeah, none. And I think that when you try to do it, so it's a horribly lengthy task to do. So that
Yep.
the project that we did with IBM with the point of sale thing that I was talking about with the cash register drawer earlier on was an attempt to do it, and it was just painful. And the difficulty with it is that I think most businesses will say that they need to be relatively light on their feet, so processes can change during the course of the working day sometimes, and sometimes you have to just invent something on the hoof. And if you document things, then it makes it easier for guys like us to come in and do what we do. But it makes it quite hard to run a business, I think. So I'm not sure that's a good answer. And I guess one of the examples I would give is, so a couple of my customers have I've moved them from basically having an accounting package and hundreds of spreadsheets onto Business Central. And I guess one of the problems that they have with that is that they have no visibility of data for analysis purposes. It's really, really hard for them to do any analysis, and therefore business decisions are either misinformed or flawed. And so they desperately want to have the phrase they always come up with is what is a single source of the truth. They want a single source of the truth. So they want an ERP system for that. But when you start installing an ERP system and saying, look, you're going to have to start applying rules to the things you do. You can't just do what you feel like doing, because you're not just on spreadsheets anymore. If you enter something here, then it's got to make sense here, 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 and over here as well. And that's always a bit of a struggle. So I think the answer is that no one documents it, hardly ever. Part of the discovery process is in documenting it, but you have to be able to design a system that allows them some degree of flex, because if you tie them down to the most rigid set of rules imaginable, then they won't want to do what you're suggesting, I think. I don't know if that answers your. Pretty sure that doesn't answer your question. I think
No,
I've done a political thing there and answered my own question and told you a story instead.
I think I share your sentiment there, and I used to think documentation. Well, obviously, we want to document these processes and make it clear, and we often get requests. Well, when I bring on a new employee, we need documentation to these processes to bring them up to speed and train them and orient them. And I've learned several things over the years about documentation. One, no one reads documentation. Like, I wish it weren't so, but it just doesn't happen. And as someone who maintains several product manuals and install guides for customers who purchase my software, I can attest I have maybe a 1% 1% of my customers actually read the documentation. And it shocks me when that happens because I'm like, wait. And they tell me, oh, this is in your documentation. I was like, it is? Because I don't even read my own documentation because I wrote it several years ago. The second thing is that, as you point out, changes in business processes and changes in the software, changes in a customization, those changes then have to go back in to the documentation, and then it becomes a maintenance problem, right? And I've dealt with that as a developer. It's like, well, you wrote this custom API for us, you developed this, where's the documentation? It's like, well, I stopped after a year, after release 36, because it was taking me longer to update the documentation and remember what I did and all these details than it was for me to make changes in the code. And guess how many people ever read my documentation from the project team or the customer? Exactly zero. I was literally the only person referring to my documentation. So I stopped. And of course, 18 months later, well, can we look at your documentation? We want to do testing. And so I don't know that there's a good solution on the functional side. On the technical side, there are some tools to self-document applications, but they are application specific, development platform specific, solution specific, and unfortunately they're not available in many, many environments. So that's what's difficult. So I would say documentation sounds good. Sometimes I do preliminary lightweight documentation just to get some basic facts and contact information and context on paper. But in terms of detailed process, step-by-step documentation, I have found that is generally not worth the time, effort, and expense.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because I know when I first started, I mean, I do this now. When I learn something new, I have to write it down. I write it down and I'll screenshot what I'm doing and I do it step by step. And quite often I'm trying to teach myself a new process, and I'll screenshot it, and it's a pain because you get to the point where everything goes wrong, and then you've got to delete that screenshot and go back and find do it right and make sure that you've actually captured the right way of doing things. And I know when I first started one of my jobs in very, very early on in my career and was being shown the way the software worked, and I had a notebook and I wrote down everything that I was being shown, and it was incredibly useful for about a fortnight. And then I just chucked the notebook away, didn't need it again, because I could just sit there and go clickety clickety click and just do everything, which is fine. Yep. And I think that's why people don't read the documentation. But in reference to what you said, that my last freelance customer, I wrote them a whole ton of documentation because they were forever saying, "Oh, we don't know how this works and we don't know how that works." And I would go, "Well, I've shown you," and they were going, "Yeah, but you need to write it down." So I wrote it all down and emailed it to the relevant people, and then I had a repository of it on SharePoint in their on their Office 365 tenant. And I left them, and I showed them where it was, and I left them with it. And they're now a customer of the partner I work with, and I'm forever getting support calls punted through to me going, "Oh, they're on the phone again. They don't know how to do X." And I just go, like, "It's here." Just send it back to them. I've told her that. Here, have it again.
In that regard, having documentation it saves me time, because when I invariably get those calls, I can just copy and paste from the documentation into the email and hit reply and say, "Oh, it's on page 6. Here's the relevant section." I don't even attach the file. I don't make them look it up. I just copy and paste and say, "Here you go." And it's like I've accepted it. It's, I'm over it. I do include some documentation time in all projects, at a minimum for my own, just for my own backup. Here's what we're doing. Here's why. Here's who asked for this. Here's how it works. Here's how you install it. Because, in 3 years, when they need to revisit something, that's when you dig that document out of the archives and have to reinstall it on a new server, reconfigure, or whatever.
And so, it's for your own use rather than anyone else's, isn't it?
Yes, in many cases, because invariably they call me back, right? It's like, "Oh, Steve dealt with that," and so they just say, "Well, Steve will deal with it again." So that's makes total sense.
I've just taken over a project from another consultant, and the other consultant has actually gone to work for the client as their IT manager, which is great because it means that she's still around and I can still ask her what's
Yeah.
going on. She went through all, so we're in the process of it's a joint BC and D365 implementation, and the two systems talk to each other obviously, and there's a whole bunch of standard integrations, but also custom APIs and all kinds of stuff going on, and there's all kinds of weird things happening, and it's all a bit unconventional, shall we say. And so I thought, well, the best way of doing this is actually for me to just go through the whole thing and just start each customer journey from the point of the customer actually phoning up and saying they want to order whatever it is they're going to order, and go through each different type of customer and put it through all the different routes that it will go through and document that as I go, so that they've got I can check how far it goes before it breaks and we've got the point where we have to then involve developers to fix the process. And B, we've actually got some documentation to hand to the customer at the end when we're training them, saying this is how it actually works. And that, I think, is incredibly useful. I found that a really useful way of dealing with it. And if I have to do that kind of thing again, I'll do just that, because I'd have been lost otherwise, I think. Because it gives me a kind of test script as well, for next time I go through it. And if any
Yep.
changes are made.
That is a good point. I have documented that in my product documentation. Like I have the general overview, but it seems that the specific scenarios of, okay, here's a problem you may run into, here's the specific resolution to that. Those sections of the documentation get used far more than,
Yeah.
click next, 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 or whatever it is. So, yep,
Yeah.
I would agree those are valuable.
And there's a kind of, so there's also a kind of there's a crossover there, isn't there, between that kind of stuff that you do on a day-to-day basis, and then someone on YouTube showing you how to do a thing, because actually it's not that they're not that far away from each other, really, are they?
Yep.
You're going
Yeah.
to absolutely have no clue how to, I don't know. Yeah, authorizations in BC is one of those things I've just managed to dodge every single time, and managed to not ever learn. And I was having a conversation with Mary Thompson about this a while ago, about saying, you actually need to be two of you to do it. How do you do that? I don't even know how to start doing that. And I've still not got around to it, but I'm going to have to get some YouTube video up and have some guy go, this is how you do it, X, Y, Z, and going, all right, okay, I'll get it. And it won't be hard, but without that kind of stuff, you're lost, aren't you?
Yeah, and I guess one of the challenges is how much knowledge can you really retain and carry around and gain. And I think I often use the term functional consultant as opposed to, say, technical consultant or developer. And in at least coming from the dynamic GP world, there was this pretty clear distinction, right? You had the functional people who didn't write code. Maybe they wrote a few SQL scripts or they did some reports or things like that. And then you had the technical people, and they took over when it involved code or scripts or SQL or queries or whatever. And oftentimes those were two very different roles, two very different people who would fill those positions. And a lot of times they did not just magically and perfectly mesh. And so there was this kind of gap in language. And I think you and I have briefly talked about when a functional person writes a requirements document, hands it over to the developer and says, code this, and you referred to it earlier, that doesn't go well oftentimes. And
No.
because this person knows this area, they don't quite understand what's possible, whereas the developer may not understand the business process, or even worse, they're not given the
Yeah.
context of that process. So having those siloed roles is often really problematic. And I found the more that the breadth, I guess the broader the knowledge a person has, so they can start to span and bridge those roles, or the closer those roles can work together, oftentimes the better result you can get.
Yeah, I agree, and I one of the things I'm trying very hard to do is to skill myself up in terms of what's possible. So I'm trying to write small extensions, really, really tiny things at the minute. Just
Cool.
adding fields
Yep.
and then saving those as extensions and making sure that's working properly. And I want to try and expand on that because one of the things I'll say to one of my consultant colleagues is, I'm sitting writing up this documentation, to the specification document, and I don't know at what point I'm sliding into Starfleet, where at what point is this real world stuff that can actually happen, and at what point am I, starting to beam people down to planets because it's actually not doable yet. And we've got there's one guy we've been working with, who he's got a really clear idea of what he wants, and I love his vision. His vision is amazing. But there's a point in time where I want to say to him, you either cannot afford or you will have to wait for the technology to catch up what you want, because you can't, we can't do it for the money you've got, and it hasn't happened yet. So you're gonna have to wait 10 years or so, because it's kind of science fiction, some of the stuff that he's asking for, and it's difficult for me as a functional consultant to know what my developer colleagues are able to do. So I'd put together some stuff for this guy I was talking about the other day, and most of it was fairly small changes to something that he'd done for us. And there was one thing, and I thought, here's a list of 18 relatively small things, like I want this field to calculate like this, and I want this field to calculate like that, and this field should be free text under certain circumstances, but it should inherit under other circumstances from another table. And it's all kind of quite straightforward stuff. And then there was just one thing I wanted him to do, and he went, "That's the hard thing." And I'm going, "Is it?" And he was going, "Yeah,
Oh,
that's
yes.
really hard." And I'm going, I had no idea how or why that's hard. And he explained it to me, and it made perfect sense after he'd explained it. But yeah, I wish I
And
knew.
yes, and this often comes up on the development customization side because a customer wants functionality that may not be native to Business Central, which
Hmm.
makes sense. That's why you're exploring the customization and say, well, I just want this.
Mm.
And well, there's a reason that does not exist in the product. And oftentimes the architecture of the application just it's not well suited to that. The request is perfectly reasonable in the
Hmm.
context of their business and what they need to do and how they need to do it. I totally agree with you. This is a great feature. Then
Mm.
you look in here and you're like, ooh, this is going to be painful because we're going to be fighting Business Central every step of the way because it was not designed to accommodate that particular type of transaction.
Yeah.
And I am so nervous about doing that type of thing because you're having to intervene and circumvent and fight the core application. And I'm like, wow, even if you
Is it
paid me
is it the
lots of
right
money,
application then?
is it
That's the
worth it?
question. Yeah. Is
And
it the right application for that customer? That's the question, I guess, isn't
yeah,
it?
well, it's 1% of what they need. So, it does 99%, but it's like, we'd really like this.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, there's this third party that kind of does that, but they want $20,000 and it has all this other stuff that you don't really want or
You don't
need.
need, yeah.
And it's like, oh boy. So I'm having that conversation now, trying to, it's like, okay, do we go down this road and how painful is this going to be? And if we offer this as a third party product, will it be profitable given the amount of effort it's probably going to take?
Yeah.
And we don't know, right? So, yep, we're just trying to figure it out. So Christian has another good question that I think is good. How do you handle situations where users and management are not aligned about processes and or outcome of the project? And I will put an additional twist on that. Not just users and management, but users, management, and the consultants who are working, helping that company make something happen. And I've been on a project where we had users, we had management, then we had project management consultants, then we
Hmm.
had technical consultants and developers. Literally 4 teams who had
Yeah.
different visions of where we were going. And those were not in agreement. And I can tell you, it did not end well.
No.
The customer got a solution, but I can tell you 4, 6, 8 years later, they were unable to upgrade that because everyone had a different vision, and you got a really you got a ball of twine and duct tape that just couldn't be upgraded.
That's horrible, and I don't like that question at all. So, I guess my starting point is what is it that you do as a business? What's the end result of what you do as a business? So what is it you need to do in order to produce profit? And that's literally the bottom line. But
Yeah.
but everything needs to align to that. And so my experience is, I've been finance director and managing director of a business before, and I've been regional manager in a very large multiple retailer. So I've stood on the bridge between management and the operatives, for want of a better word. And my experience is that 9 times out of 10, and I'll say this, 9 times out of 10, the operatives are right, because they're the ones who are actually operating the system. They're right.
Yeah.
So if you're sat in head office behind a shiny desk and you have a view of how things work, you're probably wrong, actually. And you need to have sufficient self-awareness and dignity to be able to admit that to yourself. And I think that this is the point where you need to take your brave pills and say, these guys are probably right. But what we need to make sure is that the processes that they are advocating are the most efficient ones. So you can fight their corner. I think taking sides is probably not the best plan, because your side is really that bottom line. But you can fight the corner of one aspect of it, but you're still saying, okay, guys, I'm agreeing with you, but I just need to know that what you're doing is actually the most effective and efficient way of doing it. And so you might have to give some ground in order to be able to deliver what the business needs, because the business is what clothes and feeds all those people. And so the business has to be the first entity that is considered in the equation, and not the people in the business, but the business itself, I think. And that, I think, is, I guess that for me is the seed of it, the root of it. You've got to say, what does the business actually require, irrespective of what all the people in the business feel it should. I don't know if that helps. Is that useful? Is that
No, I agree. So I look at that in two ways. One is the trite phrase, the tail wagging the dog. And so oftentimes I'll be in discussions where the accounting department is saying, look, we cannot do our jobs because the data you're providing, or the manner you're providing it, like, it requires us hours and hours to assemble all this garbage data to produce the financials that you want, because this bizarre sales process results in last minute commissions and repricing and financial implications. And so I understand their perspective and their frustration. On the other hand, the department that is producing revenue for the business is not necessarily smart to restrict them based on the accounting transaction import process, right? Like, if this allows them to sell $1 million more to a customer, the flexibility in this contract or this repricing or this discount scheme or whatever it is that gives accounting a hard time, well, that's $1 million that the business wouldn't have if you had strict data controls and reporting requirements and consistent transactions and non-variable contracts for the accounting department. So unfortunately, the accounting department's processes should not dictate how the business people sell. And I totally understand that results in some very difficult problems on the accounting side. Last minute changes, makes it hard to close the books and all that. But hey, what can we do to make the accounting department's life easier to deal with these, crazy sales schemes that the sales department comes up with to sell more product? And then the other thing I've seen is new management comes into a company and they the company may not be doing well or they may be middling along. The new management's job is to re-architect the company, increase sales, expand it, and do all these things with a vision that is not necessarily compatible with what these people have been doing for the last 10 years. And
Hmm.
so they say, I know what my job is. I know how this process works in the warehouse or in the supply chain or in fulfillment. And this is the better way. It's like, well, you know how to do it for how the business is being run for the last 10 years.
Yeah.
They need to implement new processes that allow that business to grow and double and triple in capacity so that the business can survive. And those may not be compatible. And you may need to throw out what you've been doing for the last 10 years
Mm.
to be acceptance of a new process that can grow for the next 10 years, right?
Yeah. I completely agree. I completely agree. And I think, your point about, I mean, accounting departments are often the drivers of this kind of thing. And I think it's always worth bearing in mind that they're not the ones who make the money, they're the ones who account for the money.
Yep.
And that's it's important. And I've seen on a number of occasions people saying we want to change the process, and I say, okay, well, what do you want to do? And they go, well, this is a real bottleneck for us. This here, it's a real problem, and so we think if we do X, Y, Z, it'll sort that bottleneck out. And I say, yeah, that bottleneck. What you're going to do is you're going to pick that bottleneck up, and you're going to take it out of this department. You're going to put it into this department over there, and it's
But then
still
it's
going to
going to
be a
be their
bottleneck.
problem.
But it's their problem and not your problem. And that's like, actually, for the business's point of view, it's still a problem. So why can't we can we fix the problem? Because I also think that the whole thing about crazy sales process and all that kind of stuff and not wanting to get in the way is I think it's absolutely true. You almost need a good kind of ETL process to get the data from that
Yeah.
madness into a place where accountants can actually do the job. And I guess that's what we're trying to do, isn't it? As functional consultants, is design the ETL process so that these guys out here who are actually at the coalface producing the goods can do all kinds of stuff to make sure it happens.
Yep.
And then when the revenue comes in, it comes into carefully ordered channels that then are easy to deal with and reportable and analyzable for the finance department and the operations team so that they can go on growing the business.
And the ETL point I think is important. One of the most complex business process conversations that I've had in years was a CPQ sales process, and I have to look it up every time to see what it means. Configure, price, quote. And so this company was like a hardware software reseller. So they would take, well, I'm just making this up. Maybe it's Microsoft Office and servers and Windows and whatever licenses, all sorts of software licenses. And they had this elaborate configure price quote system, and they wanted to use Salesforce for that because it was plugged into their vendors and it had these elaborate sales processes that allowed them to do these wild configurations that customers needed and produce these very complex quotes that a customers could use to purchase and assign costs to their different organizations. So they might have a request to purchase software for 50 locations across the US. And this got really involved, and I'm thinking, okay, I get why they need that, right? Like,
Hmm.
I don't know how to solve that in the ERP system. That is, an entirely different type of process. And great, if Salesforce is their tool of choice and if it has the CPQ software and functionality they need, okay. The problem for us was how in the world do we get that into the accounting system such that finance has their 30-day or whatever process they need to do a background check and credit check for this customer, because they need to know, well, how much is this going to be? What are the payment terms? What does the contract look like? They need to be ready to make the sale happen when that salesperson gets the document signed on the dotted line. Well, in
Hmm.
order to be ready, they need this information in advance. So we had this chicken and the egg process.
Oh
Well,
God,
the
yeah.
quote isn't final, but it might be final tomorrow and we want to sign and be ready to get that customer's money tomorrow. And finance is like, look, I need at least a week to do the due diligence on this $1 million deal so that we don't lose money on this. And so I was like, okay, and we're the consultants saying, how do we get this data into the system so that they can do their jobs? It was mind-boggling complex. And we were all humbled, like, wow, I don't know how to solve this problem. And so it was a very interesting look. And so whenever I hear CPQ now, I'm like, oh, let me think about that. I'll get back to you, right?
Not making eye contact.
Yep, I'm going to back away. Right. So, well, excellent. Well, we've been chatting for about an hour. Any final thoughts or gems of wisdom on functional consulting and that you want to share?
God, have I got any final thoughts? That you sprung that one on me.
Sorry.
Do you know? I think I've said everything I need to say. I think for me it's about storytelling. The whole thing is about narrative, and it has to be about how lives are actually lived. And people going into shops or phoning up businesses and ordering stuff or ordering services and what then has to happen. So it's a little bit like Mousetrap, the children's game Mousetrap with the ball bearing and all the different things. Right. It's like that. And I think it's like what happens at the point where you let the ball bearing go. And you can let the ball bearing go, and it's got to go down the chute, and then fall down the ladder, and it tips over the boot, and the boot kicks the latch, and the latch releases the trap, and all this kind of stuff happens. And what are the points where it jams and sticks, and how do you unstick that? And I think that making sure the story flows so that there are no continuity errors. So I think I was talking to you about this the other day when we were discussing it, and saying it's like when you watch a really cheap movie. And, some guy gets killed in the third scene, and then the same actor walks across in the background, 3 scenes before the end. You're going, that guy was wearing yellow before, and he got shot, didn't he? And so you've got to make sure, the same thing doesn't happen, I guess. You've got to make sure that you've got no continuity errors and that you trap the mouse at the end. So there's my mixed metaphor. Really badly garbled mixed metaphor, functional consultancy.
And I think that is a great example. I recently been rewatching some movies, classics that I've known about for years. And in the moment when you first see them, there's these action scenes and you're really just captivated by what's going on. And I think that sometimes happens in these projects, but when you replay them for the second and third time and you're watching just a little more disconnected, and I'm like, I was watching the movie Aliens, and I said, whoa, wait a minute. Why does Ripley have a lighter in her pocket in the middle of space when she doesn't
smoke? Why she got
smoke?
A cat?
Yeah, well,
Why is there a cat?
And this was a critical plot point in this one scene is she had to pull a lighter out of her pocket and set off fire sprinklers in the building. And I'm like, well, she's in the middle of nowhere on another planet, traveling months in space, and she has a Zippo lighter in her pocket in the future. And I'm thinking, what?
If she was a 12-year-old boy, I'd believe it. Because she'd pull out the lighter and some string would come out.
And so it's
baseball
those
cards and bits of chewing gum and stuff.
Those little idiosyncrasies, problem, guys. This doesn't make any sense. And so it's often hard to see some of those small but critical details in the moment unless that second person comes along and you tell them that story and they're like, well, you realize this component just doesn't make any sense. You're like, oh, yeah, we have a problem there, don't we? So, I like that. It is in the stories that you can start to capture what's going on and start to implement that as part of a business. Well, I think that's a great wrap-up point. Well, thank you very much, Mr. Perren.
Oh, it's been fun. It's been lots of fun.
Great chatting with you. And thanks to everyone for watching. And
thank you. And thanks
we'll
for Christian for asking really naughty questions. We couldn't have done it without you, man.
Yes, thank you for the script, Christian. Okay.
All right. Thanks
Steve. Everyone for joining. Everyone. Okay.
Okay.